I don't mind a spin-off, you know. Sure, taking a beloved established property and transporting the characters to a new gameplay style isn't a guaranteed win, but in the right hands, we can get things like Pokemon trading card game that we looked at recently. At best, it's a great way to bring enjoyers of other genres into your franchise, while also giving your current fanbase a new avenue to play with their favorites. At the very least, you do stand a pretty good chance of selling more copies of the game than you would with lesser-known protagonists. The trick, of course, is to make it feel natural and not forced. It needs to make sense, you know? I'm looking at you, Mega Man Sucker, or you risk alienating a bunch of people. For the somehow uninitiated, Bomberman games typically take place in these top-down arenas, where the aim is to plant bombs in the right place and with the right timing to blow up your opponent. The original Game Boy library has more than its fair share of games in the franchise that all treat with the premise slightly differently. It's often hard to even say that some of them are spin-offs, with titles such as the Robo-Warrior-style Blaster Master Boy simply translating the core game mechanics into a more elongated world, or Pocket Bomberman doing the usual thing but from a side-on perspective rather than a top-down one. Then you'll get something like the Super Beat-A-Man series of puzzly type things which are set in the same universe but really don't have many similarities outside of that. Bomberman Quest, on the one hand, certainly does retain the main Bomberman thing in that you're laying bombs with the hope of exploderizing enemies, but it does so in quite a different way to normal. If you want it summarized in a phrase, this is not dissimilar to something like Zelda, and while you might often say that with some trepidation, this definitely isn't just a rip-off, but healthily borrows just enough to stay its unique thing. There's actually a storyline now, thin as it might be, and an RPG-style overworld that you're able to wander around. It's by no means open world, as you are frequently cajoled down a very specific route, but once an area has become open to you, you're free to revisit it whenever you like, to take down that more resilient enemy once you've found a new upgrade. So yeah, it's not just about blowing stuff up anymore. Rest assured, there is still plenty of that, but now there's more of a purpose to it. The story goes here that our pal was transporting these monsters across the galaxy when suddenly something happened to the engines of his spacecraft and they all escaped, plummeting down to this planet whereby they all proceeded to start terrorizing the local populace. Your job is to walk around the 4 zones, field, forest, beach, and desert, and when you come across one of the monsters, you need to use your ever-expanding arsenal of explosives and other tools to sort them out. There are a lot of different gadgets and gizmos to find, and they're pretty much always dropped when you manage to defeat something. You're not killing these monsters, you're sort of subduing them, getting them back in their cages, I suppose. Should you do that, you'll earn things like landmines, a yo-yo that can push laid bombs away from you, steel boots that make you heavier, you'll need these for some simple puzzle solving, loads of things. As well as tools, you get these consumables that you can take to the bomb workshop in town to craft yet more explosives. Beating the first thing you come to will give you this fire power-up that looks like the token you find in normal Bomberman games that extend your blast radius. Well, what do you know, it does the same thing here, but it's not quite as simple as that. Give it to the bomb guy as well as your regular bomb and he'll upgrade it to be stronger. You can also make completely new things. Beating the first boss will grant you this explosive core, as it's called, which you can combine with some rubber, once you find it, to make rubber bombs. Some of it's trial and error, but not confusingly so. It's usually fairly obvious what needs doing. Note that some enemies you come across might be too strong, too crafty, or might simply be unreachable until you earn these new tools, so there's a fair bit of backtracking you'll need to do. That's the charm of the game though, and it doesn't overstay its welcome or ever become too grindy, but instead feels really well paced. Each of the 4 areas has a final boss somewhere, which are all holding onto one of your ship's engines, and ultimately you've got to recover them all. Beating one will not only get an engine back, but one of these explosive cores, and also increase Bomberman's overall HP by 1. Sound familiar? It's not the only loan from Link's Awakening. Each of the tools you find can be equipped to either A or B, and successful inventory navigation is a must as you'll be switching about quite a lot. As you might expect, not everything you'll find has tons of use, and you'll no doubt gravitate to the same handful of combat weapons all the time. Experimenting with different bombs is definitely one of the game's highlights though, so do at least try stuff out. I mean, sure, you'll spend an embarrassing amount of time accidentally blowing yourself up, but that's part of the charm. combat isn't the most graceful thing, but did you expect subtlety and precision when using bombs? There's a lot of hit and hope, whereby you're just laying bombs and hoping the enemy wanders into the blast, and it's something of an acquired taste. You'll either like it or be driven away by it. The main thing to bear in mind isn't so much the CPU movements, but rather the safe zones between where the bombs are going to go off. Enemies can damage you if they hit you, sure, but let's face it, you're causing most of your hurt yourself. Weirdly, this is also true for the bosses, however. The first boss, for instance, is remarkably difficult to hit yourself, as she keeps spraying your bombs with water and diffusing them, but she'll make up for that by idiotically standing right in the way of her own attacks, probably ultimately seeing herself off. So yeah, the combat has zero finesse or even skill really, taking what's always been an element of Bomberman and kicking it up to the max. Graphically, sure, this looks just fine. The colors pop really nicely, but the overworld design is a little mediocre. The monster designs are varied, both in design and quality. Some look brilliant, whereas others seem like a first draft. The soundtrack, though, is definitely a Game Boy Color highlight so far. Not up to the aforementioned Pokemon trading card game standards, but for sure on the higher end of the scale. Catchy and upbeat songs that stick in your mind. As is an absolute necessity, the explosive sound effects are excellent. All in all, as spin-offs go, this is great. It doesn't take itself too seriously, doesn't overstay its welcome, and manages to grab that rarefied air of a side quest that borrows enough of the game's tropes to stay true, but innovative enough to be its own thing. Absolutely worth a play. Would accidentally blow myself up again.